Welcome to Resilience Redefined. I'm your host, Michael Osterlink. This show is about building better humans, institutions, and systems. On the show, I'll be interviewing many different experts from across many different fields, including human optimization, health and fitness, team building, mind-body medicine. In the institutional space, we're looking at different institutions and how we can create new ones, new models and maps, including in medicine, in education, in intelligence community, in law enforcement, in the military, especially in the special operations community. Thanks for being here and enjoy the show. Most people sense that something is breaking in our world. Institutions are losing trust. Systems are lagging behind reality. And the old models for organizing society are starting to feel obsolete. But very few people are actually willing to ask the deeper question: what replaces them? Today's guest is one of those people. Max Borders is a futurist and systems thinker operating at the edge of societal transformation. He is the executive director of Social Evolution, where the mission is direct and unapologetic: liberate people and solve social problems through innovation, not dependence. He is the author of After the Collapse and The Social Singularity, two works that don't just critique failing systems, but point toward what comes next when individuals reclaim agency and new forms of order emerge. Max is not interested in incremental change. He is interested in evolutionary leaps. So today we're going to explore what happens when legacy systems collapse, what is actually means to decentralize power, and what kind of individuals a future like that demands. Max, welcome. Let's get into it.
Hey, thank you. I'm ready.
Yeah, awesome, man. I've been very much looking forward to this conversation. It's nice to finally have you on my podcast. This is great.
Indeed.
Yeah, it's
Indeed.
been
Yeah.
been a while since I've had you. It's been actually quite a few years, I think, since I've had you on the podcast. So
Finally got a little bit of a better camera and sound setup. So hopefully
nice,
it'll look better and see better compared to the past.
nice, man. And actually, since the last time you spoke, I can probably say this every time you and I speak, but between the last time and this time, a lot's happened in our country, in our world. But before we kind of jump into, you know, let's actually critique of the systems that we are operating within, talk about some of the visions you have, what could possibly replace them. Before we go down that path, like Max, tell us again, because you've been on before, but life changes people. Who is Max? And what led you to become a futurist and pretty much a social entrepreneur wanting to evolve the world we live in?
Yeah, and sometimes I even hesitate to describe myself as a futurist because
Mm,
it's become this thing that people sort of bandy about as a
mm,
way to burnish their resume or make themselves look interesting on LinkedIn. And I'm not terribly interested in that, and certainly I don't consider myself to be any sort of Nostradamus. The way if I'm going to pigeonhole myself as a futurist, it would be more to the idea of that we participate in the creation of the future and that needs to be
nice.
an active process. In other words, we can look at trends, and it's simple enough to look at trends. Someone like Ray Kurzweil, or
Mm,
these super futurists who imagine a world in which we merge with the robots and become cyborgs, or extrapolating Moore's law into the future such that we understand that there would be some sort of singularity moment, which sort of looks like we're about to hit it with respect to artificial intelligence and artificial super intelligence.
yeah.
But so yeah, all that's well and good. We have to look at the trends. I do look at the trends,
Mm,
and but I also want to do so with the idea of, I guess, using the heuristic that Matt Ridley would recommend. He's a famous science writer. You may have read him,
mm,
of
mm,
ideas having sex.
yeah.
And we employ that ideas having sex strategy, this sort of conceptual recombination, to to imagine what the future can look like, and at the same time overcome failures of imagination. Because
Love that.
really sometimes, you know, overcoming failures of imagination is a very different thing from being a utopian, and
Mm-mm,
utopianism
mm,
is not what I'm after either.
mhm.
Utopianism doesn't take into account the adjacent possible, but but can you hear that? Did you just hear that ding? Okay, sorry about that. It's in my headset. Somebody's
Mm.
texting me. I just need to turn
No,
my off.
no worries, man.
Sorry about that.
I'll have Greg clean that up.
Utopianism doesn't take into account the steps we have to get to some better future. We must always take into to account what those steps are. We can't zip from A to Z. We have to go A to B to C and so on. So that's kind of where I am. Who is Max and why does that motivate me? That's something that's it's hard for me to say. I'm an idealist, perhaps not an ideologue,
Mhm.
and I'm motivated by the idea, in some weird sense, of leaving traces for my kids, for posterity.
It's interesting because I think about like social evolution, and if you read evolution very narrowly, it's external forces have an effect on a biological system. But I listen and read your work. It's like no, it's not just we are at effect of other things outside of us. You're actually talking about us having agency, taking control, and I don't mean control in a bad way, but control over our lives, our future, and creating kind of future we want. Like, have you always been kind of, like, driven that way? Like, you're free of the constraints of, like, we have to act out the conventional ways we live our life? No, we can do it if we want, to a certain extent. There's ecological and biological limitations, of course, until recent maybe in the future, there won't be will be a lot less of them. But, like, what talk to me about, like, Max the kid and Max the young adult.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably Max the Kid was inspired by, um, was sort of baptized into libertarianism, I guess you could say, by the novels of Ayn Rand, as
Okay.
many teenagers
Mhm.
were at my age, if they were so baptized. And I use baptism as a sort of ironic way of describing it, but it really was a conversion moment reading her books. And I think there's something to these days. I think there's something quite narrow and quite. Th- I'm not. There is a core set of overlaps that I might share with Ayn Rand's objectivism or something like that. But I've developed a lot more gray hair, and with that comes a little life wisdom and a little bit more sense of the communitarian
Mhm.
and of something a little more psycho-spiritually nourishing than something like that could
Yeah.
provide.
I
But I
agree.
still have a free spirit, this idea that we should be free to experiment with various conceptions of the good as long as we don't seek to impose them on other people.
Right.
And I think there's something fundamentally both libertarian and communitarian about that way of thinking. I would even say, to the extent that we can't be utopian, there's even a little bit of progressivism and conservatism in my thinking. And
Mhm.
that may seem strange, but I think you and I share this sort of transpartisan sensibility, this desire for a more post-political world where we sort of we have the protocols around us so that we can develop and opt into various niches that more closely comport with what we think of as good and what we
Mhm.
think will work, frankly, and have those be in competition. So when you have a big lumbering leviathan that's fueled by debt spending and everybody's going, come on with the taxation and the inflation, or they're everybody, or they get into these tribal teams fighting for what they perceive as the one true way, and neither team ever gets it. They just shove these stupid policies down each other's throats that we can never get rid of, and the special interests only seem to win. Yeah, I'm ready to turn away from that. I'm ready to be experimental. I'm ready to be I don't wanna just completely tear down Chesterton's fence. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've ever heard of Chesterton's fence, but that is the old G.K. Chesterton was an old conservative, I think Orthodox thinker in England, and and the idea is if you come across a fence in a in a field or a wooded area and you don't know what it's doing, don't tear it down before you figure that out. And so he perceives certain kinds of traditions and ways of doing things as necessary to civilization. And there is some truth to that, and I want to
Yes.
acknowledge that. But sometimes the fence is what is keeping us trapped in like
Mhm.
timid herds so that they can treat us like milk cows. And I don't want to
Yes.
be treated like a milk
Like
cow.
a milk cow.
Yeah. In fact, or if you like, they use it as a fence to trap us in so they can be vampires and feast on us. And
Mhm.
I'd rather pull up the stakes of the fence and stab them in the heart.
Fair enough.
Uh, metaphorically
Yeah.
speaking,
You know, love. Yes.
I'm not a
Yeah.
violent revolutionary,
Right. Right.
but so the way I have come to think of this is not so much ideological. Ideologues like an Ayn Rand or a libertarian or sort of like a one true way progressive. They have these checklists of things that the ideal society ought to have, and come hell or high water, this is the way we're going to implement it. So there's no room for pluralism. There's no room
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
these experimental niches. So given that you have people who are sort of entirely committed to this one true way kind of thinking, my approach has been, okay, let's experiment despite the
Mhm.
existence of these sometimes very powerful people and see what we can achieve, because that's kind of the only way is using the freedom that we have to engage in what I call underthrow, which is if overthrow is the violent
Mhm.
toppling of power, underthrow is more surreptitious. It's more, how do we just go over here and start something new that gains rapid constituency groups?
Yeah.
How do we undermine power through new transparency mechanisms? How do we set up our own little jurisdiction down here on the island of Roatan and
Mhm.
do experimental biotherapies or whatever?
Yeah.
So it is evolutionary while at the same time not revolutionary in the classical sense of revolution, which is a violent overturning. It's underthrow.
Yeah. No, I love that. And I know you and I share a lot of friends in common who are kind of in the alternative education space and other spaces. You just mentioned health. Well, we can dive into that. Give us some of what you're seeing as possibilities. First, let's be a critique of the conventional medical system, the one size fits all, driven by the state, the federal government, with the states, the federal government, large corporate interest, and then give us what you're seeing. For instance, like out in the hinterlands, where some really interesting experiments are going on. Well, first maybe in education, and then in healthcare, if that's cool with you.
Sure. I mean, it can be transportation or money.
Yeah,
So, I
everywhere,
mean,
everywhere.
so one of the what's a couple of the greatest, what I call subversive innovations that have come about, we now take for granted. They're getting old. They're getting sclerotic. Um, but they were proofs of concept these subversive innovation approaches, and they existed within what, Stuart Kaufman, this great
Mm,
thinker, I don't know if familiar,
mm,
your listeners are familiar, but his work is amazing. He's an evolutionary theorist, and his, work turns on what he calls the adjacent possible, okay? The adjacent possible, if you the best way to describe it is imagine you're in a room with 2 doors, okay? Which opens into another room with 2 doors, which opens into another room with a door and a window, right? You see what I mean there. If there's no way to get from this room to a room 42 rooms down, right? You have to go through the doors those doors represent the adjacent possible. So another example might be there's no creating social media unless the internet had first been invented. So you start to think about, the way ideas have sex, and we had this awful cartel. that seemed really entrenched in transportation was called the taxi medallion cartel.
Mhm.
All right, and you as a if I'm not mistaken, you're a New Yorker,
I am
so
now, yeah.
you are now, so you know that in New York, the taxi medallions had a lot of power over years, and you sometimes people would have to come up with half a million, $1 million to be able to acquire the right to drive a taxi in New York. Well, then in 2012, there were certain kinds of technologies available, and they were able to have a confluence, right? There was the internet, HTTP, and so on. There was the GPS technology, which tracks your
Mhm.
positioning. There was all these other things that came together for a guy named Travis Kalanick in a technology called Uber, which we now take for granted. And so that was a technological means of matching riders and drivers together in a way that had never been seen before. Because when you just hold your thumb up and ask somebody to give you a ride, there's all kinds of risks associated with that. But if you have someone tracking an app that tracks you, where there's rating systems, where there's credit card and identity associated with it, where there's GPS tracking your every move, suddenly security is not such a big problem with taking Uber. So that
Mhm.
solved a lot of problems. And that represented competition for the taxi medallion cartels that had never before been imagined, but there was technological means of undermining that special interest, which was the
Right.
taxi drivers. Now, so it would be unfortunate if in 2011 you spent $1 million on a taxi medallion, but on net, having this kind of competition in the transportation space, especially for people who can't afford cars, which is most people in New York, it's another option for getting around, especially if you're in a hurry. Um, so that's transportation. The other is in money, right?
Right,
Bitcoin's
right.
not perfect. It's very volatile, but that's another example of subversive innovation. Just like Uber was for transportation, Bitcoin is for money, and money is really the central vector in a lot of the social problems that we're seeing today.
Right.
Because it's really hard if you're an American to escape the dollar regime because
Mhm.
everything is denominated in dollars. It's the world's reserve currency. And inflation causes it to lose value through time. And so when we complain about the price of eggs, people don't realize it's because Congress spent a bunch of money that we didn't have, and there had to be a way to pay for it. And so the Federal Reserve printed that money, and then it got into the economy. And so we were taxed without representation through inflation. That's the way it works. And so Bitcoin, while it hasn't taken over the world, it is still, you know, it proved a concept. It is still a safe haven, a kind of digital gold that people can, if they only would, you know, put their resources into it and hodl, as they say.
Mhm.
But you're right. There's some really interesting things going on in health as well. I'll go back to even earlier than 2010 to about 2006. But this was, I think, around this time is when this was starting to bubble up. There was a guy named, I want to say his name was Art Devaney. Yeah, and he came up with his wife had a terrible diabetic condition. So he was an evolutionary economist, if I'm not
Mhm.
mistaken. He was an economist and an
Mhm.
evolutionary thinker, but he poured himself into understanding the human body, and he came up with this diet and way of life called evolutionary fitness diet. Well, right about that time, you had a bunch of other things like the Atkins diet and ketogenic diet, which they had been using to treat people with diabetes for years. But it became, and then that extended into the Paleolithic diet or paleo
Mhm.
movement. Now, keep in mind, all this time, the medical establishment and the big ag and big food had been colluding, wittingly or unwittingly, right, to basically use the food pyramid. And the recommendation from most physicians to avoid heart attacks and strokes was a high carbohydrate, low
Mhm.
fat diet. Well, for years, people lived with that, and it was terrible for them.
Yeah.
There was an increase in heart disease, there was an increase in strokes,
Yeah.
and people couldn't figure out why, even though it seems intuitive to think you gotta have a low-fat diet. So reduce animal fats and get off saturated fats and into margarine and other kinds of things that are turned out to be terrible for you. So it wasn't a bunch of, centralized expert institutions that figured all this out. It's not to say there weren't people in academia and
Yeah. Yeah.
in some of the health institutions who weren't working on this stuff at the periphery. But this movement was really led by people who were practicing on themselves, you could say
Mhm.
biohacking or diet
Yeah. Yeah.
hacking,
Yeah.
and talking to each other in internet networking sessions.
Like a
And
Rod Wolf, Mark Sisson, Chris
Mark
Bresser.
Sisson exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, of course, Art Devaney, and these people are
Right.
all talking to each other, they're building up steam, people are applying they're like, "Oh my gosh, I've reduced my cholesterol, I've done this," and all of a sudden you get these people who are doing exactly what the experts and institutions say they shouldn't, and suddenly they're realizing through experimenting on themselves that they're getting stellar results.
Mhm.
So, um, that's just one example of how networks topple expertise hierarchies, cannot topple. And I'm not saying, look, I'm not like trying to shit all over the experts, right? We need
Mhm.
experts. We need people who
Mhm.
can operate on your brain. We need people who can work on your car, especially these days, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and we certainly need people who can do the kind of big gold standard studies to find out whether, say, oh, I don't know, experimental vaccines work.
Mm.
um, but there's so many cases in which, we have discovered over the years, especially in healthcare and in psychology, in medicine and psychology, these are big problems. We have what is known as the peer review crisis and the
Yeah.
replication crisis. Peer review, it seems to be these same people, want to publish each other's stuff and they get all famous and everything, but it turns out to be sort of a circular way of circular onanism, I guess you could call it, if you forgive forgive that uh, way of putting it. And then there's the replication crisis. They did a big meta study of replication in these and found a fellow named Nozick, a billionaire. I forgot what his first name is. A very very rich fellow did a meta study of these healthcare papers and things where they thought they had it in the bag, and it turns out 50% of them didn't replicate. Well, that's a problem. That means that if you think about everything else that's out there that we're doing to treat people or that we're telling people to do, it's a flip of a coin whether or not it's right.
Yeah.
We can do better than that. So we have seen in the health space and in the science space what you might call distributed or decentralized science or DeSci, and of course, decentralized health and fitness, which has been happening for a long time. And, you know, I can see just from knowing you over the years and seeing your posts and things like that, that you've been involved in this space for quite a while. And you are an exemplar of good health, as far as I can tell. But part of that has not been you looking up studies from the Mayo Clinic or Harvard. It's also been talking to people who are really, really care about their bodies and have every incentive um, to think things through in interesting and novel ways and try it
Yeah.
out. Yeah.
You must love, since you like decentralization and experimentation, the peptide movement or the psychedelic movement, in the health space, psychiatric, psychological, and physical medicine space. What are you noticing in even those two, or even I've seen energy medicine becoming more of an interest to a lot of people. And when I say energy medicine, I don't just mean like a Reiki, but like you can get these devices that measure brain waves. You can change your brain through these
Mm.
cool technologies. You don't have to go to a clinic. You can just do it at your own home.
Yeah, those are really interesting. I forgot, the mechanism, for how those work, that but they essentially are designed to some of them are about, well, some of them are brainwave, so you can
Mhm.
set them to sort of activate different alpha, beta, delta
Delta.
brainwaves for different kinds of things that you're looking to get out of it in terms of your cognition, your cognitive
Mhm.
states at a certain time, or your emotional states at a certain time. They can
Yeah.
be affective too. Um, and of course, you can get, I think is it delta and theta brainwaves that are sort of like between wake and sleep. But
Mhm.
anyway, these technologies, they can, they put diodes or something, they can register the kind of brainwaves you have, and then somehow uses selective attention, your brain and body's ability to attend to different things, right? Presumably, right now, people are watching or looking at my face and in my eyes and attending to the sound of my voice rather than noticing the refrigerator over there, right? The noise of the background noise of the refrigerator. And in so doing, they those devices are able to help us manipulate our brain states. There's
Mhm.
also breathing techniques,
Yeah, yeah. Right.
holotropic
Right.
breathwork and other
Yeah.
breathwork techniques that go
Yeah.
far back, very far to the yogis who probably spoke Sanskrit. You know,
Mhm.
my wife is really into some of these breathing methods as yoga nidra.
Well,
Which
cool. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
and
Right, right.
so there's all kinds of stuff like this in the health space that doesn't require sort of intervention, medicine, taking a pill or surgery, right?
Mhm.
That can be really effective, and, you have presented some of those in terms of
Mhm.
taking care of your body, getting sleep, eating right, just the basics, working out. Are you moving your My wife is like, "Are you moving your body enough?" As she
Good for
says to
her.
me on the way to yoga, right?
Nice,
And
nice.
and and I think, that for her has been a tremendous health and fitness, but stress management tool. Um and of course, her yoga nidra sessions are magical. There's also the psychedelic space you mentioned.
Yeah. Yeah.
I am extremely heartened by this in the sense that, well, there's a couple of things. There is a kind of perception of psychedelics as being part of just bacchanalian hippies, right?
Mhm.
Going crazy at parties in the 60s or at Burning Man or something like that. Um, Although I will say in defense of Burning Man that, people who use psychedelics at Burning Man, that there are all kinds of redundancy systems and safety systems in
Oh,
place
that's good.
so that there are safe havens for people who, have bad trips and so on,
That's good.
right? Because really a lot of, quote unquote, having a bad trip is, you're bringing a someone who is, almost always people who have had bad experiences with psychedelics, um, have, eh, existing unresolved traumas or issues, or, mental health issues, and so you need to be very careful about these things. I liken it to it. I like the sort of medical way of looking at it, but I
Mhm.
also like the mystical or spiritual way of looking at it
Mhm.
within the container of religio, right?
Mhm.
And that is to say, psychedelic substances need to be taken very seriously. You need to have set and setting. You need to make sure that you are in a place psychospiritually that you can handle a peak experience like this
Mhm.
and be prepared for its transformative effects.
Yeah.
But its transformative effects are overwhelmingly positive, and more and more every day. Forgive me, I forget his name, Carhart Harris, I think it is,
From the UK.
from the UK, and then the
Yeah.
people at MAPS,
Yeah.
have all done tremendous work on, psilocybin mushrooms.
Mhm.
on, they're doing more with, DMT, which is, has very interesting, effects, LSD,
Mhm.
and psychedelics. I liken it to the understanding the difference between the sacred and profane, right? Which is common to almost every religion.
Yeah.
In any kind of religious ceremony involving a fire, what do you notice about the fire? It has a boundary,
Okay.
usually has rocks around it, right?
Uh,
If the fire is sacred, there's a place that you don't go too far, right? So you 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 enjoy the warmth of the fire. You enjoy the sacramental substances and their effects, but you do so within within a space, a set and setting that contains the fire. Okay, and I think we would do well to look at many things in this regard. Whether it is you look at it as excess or deficiency, like
mhm.
finding the golden mean
Mhm.
in the Aristotelian sense,
Mhm.
or if you look at it as making sure you don't try to put your hand in the fire and get burned by it. Respect its power and still warm yourself with it
Right, right, right.
by it. So that's the psychedelic revolution that's come about this century is enormously promising in this way, and and I think people have learned the lessons from times when, people were jumping out of windows or, that kind of thing on psychedelics because that can happen. So
Yeah.
you have to respect the fire.
Yeah.
But the positive knock-on effects of the use of psychedelics is that people are finding that they're able to, um, really, in a healthy way, adapt their brain chemistry and to positive effect, both in terms of, um, getting out of addictive patterns
Mhm. Mhm.
or resolving, PTSD.
Mhm.
Some of the experience with these, wounded warrior guys
Yeah.
and their traumatic experiences overseas when they come back, these soldiers, these veterans, is extremely positive results for not just, the traditional class of psychedelics, but for MDMA therapies as
Yeah.
well. So, MAPS has been at the forefront of this, doing great work. Um, the Imperial College in London, Carhart Harris. These these groups have really done a great job of blazing the trail, and I suspect that even though these were, traditional experts working in universities and nonprofits, they are very plugged into networks of people who also have intuitive understandings of these substances.
So, kind of let's go from the individual level, someone who, is N of one. They're experimenting on themselves and, taking control of their own lives. And I don't use control in a bad way, but in a positive way. To a kind of a higher cultural level, because the examples you gave, and I'll throw in peptides too. Your pushback on peptides, this administration seems, or JFK seems to be pro peptides, is moving in a different direction. Psychedelics, there was a shut down, and since the late '60s, early '70s on them. It's opening back up in our culture. I think ultimately is a good thing. There's some challenges that are in that space that you and I
I
would agree
I
with.
don't just really quickly, I don't know enough about peptides. I see people
Okay.
losing weight and a lot of people getting a lot of positive results out of them.
Yeah.
And I've also heard horror stories too,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's just internet stuff. To be fair, uh, I would say go peptides if people are losing, 50, 100 pounds and resolving serious issues. I know that my morbidly obese father who keeled over at 71 would have benefited from them and he would have lived a lot longer.
Yeah. Yeah, and I wasn't even asking you necessarily for your take on them personally, but in terms of the
Gotcha.
context of what you teach. It's like, hey, we want more people to be free to experiment.
Sure.
And those are examples in our culture of people experimenting. And I brought in education. We have Michael Strong in common as one example, but there's a lot of really interesting
Yeah.
things in the education space Mapper Doe, like as another example, like there's a lot of really cool people doing really cool stuff. Can you speak to what you're seeing in the education space as kind of decentralized? And I don't necessarily want to put it in the context of like in opposition to the conventional systems, but I think we also have to talk to, like you, to talk to some of the limitations of the conventional systems and what these are offering us in the kind of the outskirts of our culture.
Yeah, so one of the most promising things I'm seeing, and look, this is a mixed bag, I will grant. So at
Mm,
some of the stuff, it's always gonna be attached to policy, and we're seeing more and more of the sort of Milton Friedman style tax credits and
mm,
vouchers, which are essentially vouchers that are starting to happen in a lot of states. In other words,
yeah.
these are getting passed and kids are being rescued from, traditional government schools that are failing, especially poor kids. And I think that's on net a good thing because there again, you get more competition, you get more options for these kids, and you get more experimentation. And of course, the thing about big bureaucratic systems is that they're not very experimental.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so we started seeing, Arnie Duncan, of all people, who was Secretary of Education under Barack Obama. You'd think of Barack Obama and sort of progressive left president as being very much about, lumbering bureaucratic systems, centralization of control, and so on. But it turns out Arnie Duncan wasn't. Now he wasn't as much of an extremist or experimental as I was, but he was certainly willing to introduce sort of flavors of school choice and school choice options. And and that was, I think, a positive aspect of Barack Obama at the policy level. And then on, I guess you could say, the other side of the aisle, there's been more of these Milton Friedman style tax credit
Mhm.
arrangements and so on at the state level, where you can essentially, instead of you're sending your kids to school that they're designated and accepting whatever comes out of that, they have more options, whether it's, I forgot what they're called.
Like a charter school.
Yes, thank you. Charter schools or
Mhm.
private schools that use public dollars. A lot of
Mhm.
people feel uncomfortable with that because it's like
Yeah.
some people, because Catholic schools are really good, right? You on net, any given Catholic school is gonna be really good. I'm not a Catholic. My kids aren't Catholic. In fact, yeah, I have a little girl who's Jewish, because her mom's Jewish. But it's like if she was in a really bad school, I think, my wife talks about growing up in Chicago, and everybody knew that the Catholic schools were good, and you
Mhm,
might
mhm.
send your little Jewish kid or whatever to the Catholic school,
Yeah.
and that's okay, right? Because that's the trade-off you're willing to accept. Where people get uncomfortable with that is the idea that public dollars are going to a private religious institution, and that sort of it kind of, creates some friction with the First Amendment.
Yeah.
Using public
Yeah.
dollars that go to a religious institution, and I'm sympathetic to that view. But I think, in a pragmatic world, I'd rather have poor kids going to private schools than worrying too much about whether public dollars are going to a religious institution, if that makes
I
sense.
Yeah, and on the flip side of it too, a concern that I might have, or do have, is like if public money, taxpayer money is going to a private school, how much influence does the state have in what happens in that school? They
Well,
allowed to push
exactly.
their agenda into the
Yeah,
school.
that's the
I mean, kind of
downside.
ruin the whole education that's, the benefiting the kids.
Well, that's right, and that's really the risk, is how many strings over the years are they gonna be able to pull if they
Yeah.
take public dollars? Or how many regulations are they gonna have to accept? I mean,
Yeah.
state standards and all the things that got us here in the first place, are they gonna try to ram down their throats? That could happen. The other thing that could happen is you could start seeing, like you have in higher education, is it more ways that you publicly subsidize something, that more there tends to be inflation, right? This happens with
Sure.
universities,
Yeah. Right.
whether you get federal federal dollars, state dollars, and publicly subsidized student loans or federal subsidized student loans. These are all ways that have contributed to tuition inflation at higher education. The same thing can happen with the schools if you're not careful. So what
Right.
was affordable for before and high quality is no longer really that affordable, even
Yeah.
if it's
Right.
still high quality.
Right. Right. That makes sense. Last place in education. What are your thoughts? Because you're into decentralization and freedom of like homeschooling, deschooling, unschooling. The kind of growing phenomenon of micro schools too.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting things happening. You just listed a whole bunch of them. And I think the way I like to think of it is you have to cultivate kids in their education, right? But if you think of it as being rather like a greenhouse, and each of them is a particular kind of beautiful flower, okay? But a crocus compared to a peony, they don't need the same amount of water, the same amount of light, the same amount of fertilizer and soil and exposure and so on. Each flower, each plant has different set of needs. And so kids are kind of the same way. So what we see with these arrays of this array of different options, we have schools that are more for kinetic kids, kids that want to move their bodies more, you know, rather than just handing kids Ritalin and having them sit under fluorescent lights and 5 by 5 chairs all day long and expect them not to move their bodies and call them, you know, ADHD. And I'm not saying there's no such thing as ADHD, but I'm
Right.
saying there's probably a lot of overdiagnosis of giving
Hmm.
kids Ritalin so they'll sit still in school, rather
Hmm.
than finding educational options that allow them to balance, getting their sillies out, moving their bodies, getting kinetic with some of the more, sort of cognitively focused activities. And it's just some kids need that. It's just plain and simple. And some of that falls down on gender lines, not entirely, but, like,
Hmm.
that tends all to be boys too, so boys take more Ritalin than little girls.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I think, providing these different kinds of options to kids, these different kinds of experiments, they're finding some negative correlation with having digital-only education for more than 4 hours
Yeah.
a day,
I've seen that.
and I think that there's something to that we need to really pay attention to. Uh, Especially also since 2010, the kids come home and get on digital. They go from a school screen to another kind of screen to another kind of screen before bed, and this can't be good for their selective attention or their cognitive development, much less their social development.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Exactly. Exactly.
so all of these are important vectors to understand, but the more we experiment, the more we may find that, okay, but an hour a day learning math with an AI tutor is they're knocking it out of the park, right? Another 2 hours a day on project-based group work,
Mm.
they're knocking it out of the park. Or there are even some experiments like, with call and recitation that have been around for a good while, like 10, 15 years now. Thales Academy is one of these,
Mm.
and they essentially have Thales Academy is in the Southeast. They're all over the place, and their model is essentially, um, they found what works, they experimented, they found out what works, and they have these manuals, the teachers use them. They don't have a bunch of sports programs, they don't have a bunch of ancillary stuff. They have nice, good quality shelters for the kids and classrooms, and then they have learning materials. But it's very social, it's very call and response. Not
Mm.
entirely, but to some degree. So it's participatory, it's rote, it's repetitive, and the parents love it. It costs like $600 a month, which is yeah,
Cheap.
it's right. And on a 600 bucks a month for private school, and they're getting 5-star ratings, and all these kids love them. And they have now primary primary education and middle school and high school, or sorry, I forgot what you call elementary. Sorry, elementary, middle school,
Okay.
and high school. So this just goes back to the idea of decentralization and
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
experimentation. This is the recurring theme in all of this. If we find out what works and have a little bit of experimentation and then monkey see, monkey do, we can start to figure out more of what works at the level of the network rather than at the level of the expert. Because the
Yeah.
experts in education tend to want to have a command and control curriculum and
Yeah.
treat kids like buckets that they're meant to fill with knowledge based on standards. It's a
Yeah.
Soviet breadline model of education that I
Yeah.
think has failed.
And I actually go from the network down to the individual. I think back to medicine, we have bioindividuality with what we're learning about epigenetics, for instance. Like, how I process saturated fat once you learn my genetics is different perhaps than you, which would require me to have a different diet depending on how I want to optimize my health. How you process caffeine is different than how I process caffeine. When I should take a certain medicine a certain time of the day, if I even should take it, is based on my bioindividuality. There are no necessarily like universals. It's like, I mean, there are because we're human beings. There's constraints, but like it's very individualized. And I could imagine our education can get there if it's not there for some people already. Like, how do you learn the best as an individual?
Well, and that's really that's really the crux, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
like, how do you best serve the kids, an individual kid? And it's not the kids. It's the kids, but it's also the kid, right?
yeah,
It's both things. We want to serve as many kids as possible. And that is, of course, been a traditional goal of public education. And that is very noble. But that usually comes at the expense of the question of how you serve the kid. And
yeah, yeah,
each kid has a bespoke set of approaches to individual needs.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, this must be an exciting time for you to be alive for the way you think about things and the work that you do. Because I can imagine, like, the way I think about it is this, and this might fit into your paradigms. Like, in every area of life, we are concentrating power. And in the same areas of life where we have opportunities to decentralize power, and we have great examples, and it seems to be like this competition between these two forces. Because
Right.
of the technology, the ones over here have more opportunities to try and experiment new things.
Well, and honestly, sometimes this for me is just like I like to think and write about this stuff.
Mhm,
But this really hit home for me, speaking of Michael Strong, when my son was going to a big, highly competitive Texas public high school in Austin. And he was profoundly unhappy there. He,
mhm,
this is a kid who he's a smart kid, but he had trouble paying attention. He hated it. And he'd sometimes, I'd find him sort of silently crying on his way to going to school because he just hated it. And you know, we lived in a and I guess you call it a school jurisdiction or whatever, where everybody was kind of a tiger mom,
mm.
if you know the whole tiger mom
Yeah,
thing.
yeah,
So
yeah.
they're all trying to get their kids into Harvard,
Mhm,
and they 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 come from the Asian or subcontinental diaspora, so they have a whole familial culture of you come home and you practice piano and you do your homework before you have any kind of life, right? And I was never that way as a kid. I was always really imaginative and wanted to do things on my own in my own way, and I'd actually read, just book after book after book and draw pictures and do projects and cool things by myself and sometimes neglect my homework in the process, right?
yeah, I hear you.
And so it was like I kinda had this, but other kids require structure. Turns
Mhm,
out
mhm,
there's you know, my 2nd child, my 10-year-old is really thriving in a structured learning environment. Well, he's not very happy about it, and sometimes he's blue about going to school, as all kids are, but he is doing very well, he's making straight A's, he's got buddies at school and so on. I don't he's not, profoundly depressed
yeah, yeah,
about school
yeah,
like my high schooler was. And so so we turned to the Socratic Experience, Michael Strong's online
mhm.
school, which is
Nice.
Socratic and it's not, like, sort of, what you would call it, like, stimulus response robot games, which is
Mhm,
what a lot of the kids are doing at school, right? In these schools where their cognitive abilities have diminished in time.
mm,
They are doing more social interaction. where they talk about things, where they ask questions and answer questions. So it's very social. It
Hmm.
very much replicates a Socratic classroom environment, and
Yeah.
that I think is better, and it's certainly better than a kid who was just profoundly depressed because he wasn't anymore. Now, that being said, I don't want to go too far into my own son's personal life. He's a brilliant guy. He's got a lot of promising things in front of him. He now works with me um,
Nice.
as
Nice.
a vendor
Okay.
uh, and uses his considerable talents on lots of things. But I think we also need to look at schools that are proximate so that kids can have more embodied kinetic experiences, more direct face-to-face social interaction. Heck, even pick up the scent of pheromones. Although he did meet his girlfriend online, lives across the country, and they've been together
Nice.
for 2 years now. So go figure.
Nice. All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
You had mentioned a few moments ago about the writing you do. Where can people learn more about your books, the regular writing you do? You have a podcast. I see your stuff on Substack, all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, certainly Underthrow is my Substack. I mentioned the term underthrow before. And I poached that from a fellow named Michael Gibson, who's a brilliant guy. He used it as a throwaway line in one of his pieces. He was like, basically, we can underthrow power one contract at a time, is what he said.
Nice.
And I loved that. I picked it up and I ran with it. And now it's starting to get out as a little bit of a, I wouldn't say in mimetic fashion. It's not a meme per se, but it's definitely become more viral, the term. And I like that. I'm okay with it. Um, I just, I want people to give Michael Gibson credit for it, but I gave him credit and poached it for the name of my Substack, so you can find it at underthrow.org, and that'll go to my Substack, and it's also the name of the podcast, which you can find on YouTube as well, and, yeah, you can watch the podcast on Substack if you prefer. So
Yes.
that's
I see
I
that there
also
too.
write I also write something that's a little more on psychospiritual lines, called, The Gray Robes at thegrayrobes.org.
Make sure
So
to plug
one is
that. Yeah.
yeah, so one is more, this is sort of like your left brain and your right brain. One is about
Fair enough.
systems, processes, decentralization, politics, and economics, and the other, of course, is virtue, excellence, psychospiritual development, personal development, theological questions, and philosophical questions.
Love that. Actually, I'd like to invite you back for a second conversation on those things. It'd be
Yeah,
fun to
I
have that
love it.
conversation and do a deep dive on that. Okay, cool. Max, thank
Wonderful.
you.
Be happy to.
Yes. Yeah, good to have you back on. I'll have you back on soon enough. I appreciate the work you're doing. It's really, really important. And I want to encourage everyone to literally check out your Substacks, read your books, and follow your work. Thanks.
Thank you so much.